Gardening is hard enough without wasting your time on an activity that may not work at all. There's a lot of advice out there, but there's also a lot of misinformation out there. Hi, I'm GardenerScott, and I discuss everything gardening so that you can become a better gardener. Today I'm going to share with you 7 gardening tips that you can probably ignore. For the most part, if you are actively doing one of these tips and you like it, well, then I say keep doing it. If it's something you enjoy and something you find benefit in, then I don't find anything wrong with it. And except for one very common tip, they're really not going to cause any harm or damage to your plants in the garden. But there's so much that gardeners, especially new gardeners, are told to do because that's just the way we do it. And I really don't think that's necessarily accurate with a lot of these tips that are being spread around. Let's begin with compost accelerators. Now, this is a product that you will buy that is supposed to make for better compost or quicker compost or some other benefits that the manufacturer touts. Well, I think the reason we think we need a compost accelerator is because of the mystery of compost. We all know compost is great for the garden and that we're supposed to compost. And beyond that, we don't really know what to do. There's browns and there's greens and we mix them together in some unknown ratio and it takes time, and then we have compost. But if we throw something on it to make that process easier, well, let's buy it. And that's what the compost accelerator industry is relying on, that we don't have the knowledge and we think that there is some magic bullet to make it easier. Well, compost accelerators really aren't a magic bullet. Most of them won't even tell you what the ingredients are. You're just supposed to add it to your compost. But there's some simple things that you can do to actually accelerate your compost. If you just chop it up into smaller pieces, it's going to break down faster. So shred it, chop it, and then compost it, you will accelerate your compost pile. Most compost piles tend to be a little too dry, so the bacteria isn't operating at maximum efficiency. Well, if you just water your compost pile a little more often, you're going to accelerate the decomposition. That bacteria also needs oxygen. Too many of us just put everything in a pile and wait for it to decompose. And even if you do add a compost accelerator, nothing's going to happen until you've got some oxygen added. So get in there and turn the pile. That'll increase the oxygen, that'll boost the bacteria, that will accelerate the decomposition. If you just follow good, normal processes in making your compost, small pieces, a moist pile, oxygen, and attention from you as to the ingredients that you add between the nitrogen and carbon components, your compost will work fine, and you don't need to spend money on some product that probably will have no effect at all. If I were to select the one tip about tomatoes that I've seen more than any other, it's to add Epsom salts. That the Epsom salts will make your tomatoes grow better. It's everywhere. You've probably heard it. You probably already do it. Well, the issue with Epsom salts is that usually they really aren't necessary. Epsom salts are magnesium sulfate. Most of our soils have an ample amount of magnesium and an ample amount of sulfur for our plants because the plants only use a small part of it. If you are deficient in magnesium and or sulfur, then yes, Epsom salts can make a difference. But as far as our tomatoes are concerned, they might not be giving you all the benefits you think, and instead might actually be harming some of your fruit. And here's what happens. That magnesium that the Epsom salts will put into the soil actually competes with the calcium in the soil. So our tomatoes are getting a bunch of magnesium and not getting any calcium. Well, that can be a problem because blossom end rot is a very common problem that we have when growing our tomatoes. It's a calcium deficiency. There's usually plenty of calcium in the soil, but if it can't get into the plant and into the fruit, then blossom end rot is going to develop. It's usually a watering issue. But if you're watering perfectly and using Epsom salts, you may still get blossom end rot because the plant can't absorb the calcium because the magnesium is getting in the way. So this is one of those tips that I suggest you avoid. It's not going to give the plant all the benefits you think you need unless you know from a soil test that you are deficient in those nutrients. And so to avoid blossom end rot, water correctly and don't use Epsom salts. And here's another one I'm sure you've heard. It's about coffee grounds. That you shouldn't use coffee grounds because they will acidify your soil. Or conversely, if you're trying to grow acid-loving plants, then you should amend with coffee grounds and use coffee grounds as a mulch because they will acidify the soil. Well, sadly, coffee grounds have very little effect on soil pH. Think about it. Now, if we were to use the raw coffee grounds, sure, there's some acidity there. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the used coffee grounds. So after you pour boiling water over those grounds, it's going to let loose of all that acidity and all of those chemicals that give you the wonderful coffee taste. And what's left behind is basically just a little bit of organic material that no longer has any of the acidity in it. Now, depending on what test you rely on, the pH of used coffee grounds will range between 6.2 and 6.8. That's not very acidic at all. So to use it as a primary ingredient or not use it as an ingredient because it affects the soil pH is totally bogus. Instead, I encourage you to use coffee grounds because it has no impact on the soil pH. Use them in your compost. Use them as a soil amendment because there is nitrogen and there are other nutrients. Because of its organic components, coffee grounds can be great for your garden. Just don't worry about the pH concern. Milk and coffee often go great together. A lot of people prefer milk in their coffee. So let's talk about milk, specifically milk as a fertilizer. And you may have seen this as a recommendation, as a tip to make your plants grow better. Well, let's break this down. Most of milk is water. And we know that by just watering, we're not fertilizing our plants. Milk is organic. And like the coffee grounds, there will be some nutrients in it. Very, very small amounts of nitrogen. So conceptually, the idea of adding an organic material to our plants like milk could make sense because the nutrients act as a fertilizer. But because of all that water and because the nutrients are such a small percentage of the milk, it is not an effective fertilizer by any measure. And milk is usually not free for most of us. So now we're paying to use a very inefficient fertilizer. If you break it down to the amount of nitrogen and other nutrients that are present in a gallon of milk, it's so minuscule that when compared to just about every other form of fertilizer, milk becomes extremely expensive for the amount of nutrients that it will provide. So totally ditch this tip. It's an expensive way to basically have no effect. You're wasting your money. It's not necessary. This next tip does have some validity in some areas for some gardeners with some plants. And that's the idea that you shouldn't water your plants in the evening. The idea being that that water that is in the soil and resting on the leaves because you didn't know how to water will stay wet all through the night, and they'll promote the growth of fungus. And so your plants in your garden can have a fungal problem. And that might be true in areas with very high humidity, that if you water your plants in the evening and you're keeping the environment excessively humid, then sure, there's the possibility for fungal growth. But it's probably going to be happening whether you water your plants or not. What's more important is that you look at your plants and you water them when they need water. And that could very well be the evening. For me and a lot of gardeners who are growing in dry areas, well, we really should be watering in the evening because that's the time of day that the plants are less stressed and they're relaxing overnight. The soil is nice and moist, and the plants can reabsorb that water and enter the day strong and ready for the sun that's going to hit them. In an area like mine right here, it's morning, and this soil is already drying out, and I watered it last night. I have to water at night and the morning to keep my young seedlings growing. So to just blindly say that you shouldn't water in the evening would do me a disservice, and it would adversely affect my plants. So this is a tip that may be appropriate for you, but I think for most of us, you can ignore it. Water when you need to, and you're probably going to need to water after a really hot, dry summer day. This next tip is very common, and not just for backyard gardeners, but for professionals who should know better. And the tip is to stake trees when you plant them. Now, if you look at this tree and all the ones behind me in this little mini orchard, I haven't staked any of my trees. I put them in bare root and I'm letting them grow. This is how they get nice and strong. They're exposed to the wind, they're exposed to the weather. It's just like Mother Nature does with every tree growing. A good, strong tree grows when it doesn't have support, when it doesn't have that crutch to help it grow. Now, there is a kernel of truth associated with this tip. If you're buying a big potted tree, then staking, a support, might be necessary. The pot has just a little portion of roots growing, maybe only 12 to 18 inches in a pot. And the tree might be 10 or 12 feet tall, if not taller. Well, that full tree with the leaves will put a lot of strain on that small root ball. Staking it, giving it some support, is necessary until the roots develop. What has evolved is this tip that you should always stake trees. Well, for the most part, since I'm planting the young bare root trees, I never stake trees, and I've never had an issue because they're going to grow strong, they're going to grow straight, and I'm going to be very happy without giving them reliance on a crutch that could hinder their future growth. This next tip is a good example of where common sense gets in the way of scientific principles. And the tip is that when you're growing in containers or pots, you should put gravel or shards of broken pots at the bottom, and that will increase the water drainage within this container. Well, the problem is that's not the way water works. In actuality, when water is moving from one material to another material, it stops at that interface. So if we've got gravel in a pot with soil above it, the water will flow through the soil. But when it hits that layer of gravel or any other material, it's going to stop draining. It's actually going to stay within the soil. Not normally a big problem until you get to the situation like many of us do, which is to overwater because we're thinking that the gravel will drain away the excess. No. What happens is the soil starts absorbing that excess water. And there should be air within our soil. We should have about 25% of our soil that is actually air, the little pockets. Well, those little pockets of air within the soil will now start filling with water. And in essence, we end up drowning our plants because the water can't drain through. At some point, when the soil is oversaturated, the water has nowhere else to go, and then yes, it'll drain through the gravel and out the bottom. That should actually be a bad sign. If you've got something in the bottom of your pot for drainage and you see the water draining through, it could be an indication that you've been overwatering. Again, if you've been doing any of these things and you find benefits to them, then keep doing it. Don't allow me to change the way you garden. If it gets you out into the garden, I think just about any activity is worthwhile. But if you're new to gardening, or if you're willing to reconsider how you garden and maybe save yourself some effort, then consider that these tips might not be in your best interest. And maybe you'll ultimately find that you can save a lot of time and devote that time and that energy and that effort to making your garden better and having better success with your plants. If you like this video, well then give me a thumbs up and share it with others who might be interested. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.